thank you so much for having me. I am here to talk about what comes after all the amazing things we've learned today and that we learned from our colleagues. Often my experience is I come to these events and I take in all these great concepts and new ways of thinking about sport, but nothing happens with those ideas if we do not take on ownership to communicate them effectively so that others want to adopt them as well. So that's what we're going to talk about. A little bit about me again. It is hockey. That is my sport. It's exactly the same as football, except we have skates and ice and sticks and half as many people. But it is essentially the same in that mathematically we're asking a lot of the same questions that football asks. And in fact, the joke was made earlier today that soccer is 20 years behind baseball. Hockey is probably 20 years behind soccer and football. So we're trying. In our data experience publicly, it is mostly event-driven data that we have. We do have data that is tracking data that is captured from broadcast that is available through private companies. And our teams in the league do have chip tracking data, and I would give my left arm to see it, but that is not to be my benefit today. But let's get started. Are we gonna go? There we go. So again, data is not enough. We are all inspired by the findings that we have heard or that we find in ourselves. But I love to share this cartoon. I'm old enough to remember The Far Side. I share this every time I talk about this. This is an example of what I'm sure I've experienced, maybe you have too, when you try and explain a new concept to someone who doesn't live in our world. We've got all the terms, we've got all the logic, we've got all the process, and they just hear blah, 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 blah. Right? Anyone else have that experience? No one. 2 people. Oh, see, I'm going to keep you awake yet. Here we go. All right, so this is a little tidbit from Seth Godin, who's a leadership thinker that I love to follow. He has a great blog. But you all can read, but I'd like to draw your attention to this last paragraph in particular. We have a story problem. All of us do. We're not doing a good job of developing the empathy to turn all the data we've assembled into a story that others can understand. So that is why I like to use the term data-driven storytelling, is that we can drive adoption of all of the phenomenal work we're doing and learning through storytelling that brings that data to life. So let's start with the what. Hey, look, I wrote some code. I was really proud of it. Go me. But the what is, of course, the research. And what I like to emphasize, I loved hearing what Anna talked about earlier this morning. I used to stress that I thought every sports team needed a translator. And an individual who was in hockey challenged me back and said, no, our analysts need to learn to be translators. Otherwise, how do they learn to advance? Right? You can be the best mind in the world, but if you can't communicate and translate those ideas, your work will ultimately be hindered in sport. So we start with the work. Maybe it's something you develop. Maybe it's something someone else developed and that you take the time to understand. Confirm the findings. Make sure they make sense to you, whether it's your work or not. And then most importantly, when we're talking about what we want to communicate, follow your envy. The easiest way to make sure you put the work in to communicate effectively is to love what you're sharing, to be passionate about it. There are certain analytical concepts that drive me nuts. They're usually the last ones I touch on, right? So follow your envy. That's the what. One of the things I have found in my experience in this field is that because we have such smart people among us, and we know all the work that went into, for example, a research paper, we want to talk about everything. To be an effective communicator, this is my challenge to you. Communicate one concept at a time. If you're around me when I'm writing a story or when I'm preparing to go on air, you'll hear me muttering to myself, what's the point? What's the point? What's the point? Center down your communication around the one concept that you want to get across. Similarly, maybe you just look at one aspect of a player, their game, or one aspect of a team. And to protect all of the other things that you know matter, but keep your communication concise and clear, acknowledge there are other points. all right? Today I'm going to talk about this player's ability to put the puck in the net. We're not going to talk about how he got the puck. We're not going to talk about whether he's good in other scenarios. We're just talking about this, but these other things exist. It's also important to acknowledge when we know there are holes. We don't know about this, or we don't know if this other thing is a contributing factor. I'm just talking about this, okay? So the why. This is a little inside joke with myself, because a lot of us get into sport to win the ultimate prize. This is the Stanley Cup. This is Sam Ventura. He won 2 Stanley Cups with the Pittsburgh Penguins, and he's currently building a knockdown, top-notch analytics department with the Buffalo Sabres. But when I say think about the why, set that aside, the ultimate goal. When you are thinking about a communication or a data point or an analysis lesson that you want to communicate, ask yourself the context for your communication first. Is it education? The Seattle Kraken, who I work for, are a 3-year-old NHL team. My entire first year was focused on educating our fans on the basics of hockey analytics. Just know what this means, okay? That's going to help frame how you communicate effectively. Are you looking to drive adoption? Maybe you're trying to implement a new strategy. Maybe you're trying to introduce someone new into the lineup or a trade. Is your point to drive adoption? Or thirdly, are you just doing analysis? That's a lot of what I do in my job, but maybe that's what you're doing for your coaches or for scouts or something like that. Pick your why. Sometimes it can be more than one, but I find most times it's usually one for our most effective communication. The other thing you have to think about is who. All right, so there are a couple main groups I like to think about when we say who. There's, of course, subject matter experts. I don't know many of you, I know there are some hockey people in here, but when I'm around people like this, they're my people, right? We're the nerds, we're the data people, we love sport, and we love seeing them come together and come to life. All right, so those are our fellow analysts, our academia, our employers potentially. This audience is going to allow space for a different kind of communication. Similarly, we have external. Are you talking to someone outside this world? Are you talking to someone who doesn't know what R even is, right? Who is this person? Are they just showing up at your game for the first time? How are you going to communicate effectively with them? Maybe that's an employer too. And then finally, a group that I feel like we used to ignore, again, shout out to Anna and Nathan for some of their comments earlier today, our internal audience, our coaches, our scouts, our front office employees. You'll notice I have a question mark next to players. In the hockey world, it is my opinion that we don't need to take numbers to players. That's my experience with the kind of athletes that are playing pro hockey in the US and Canada today. Sports you're involved in may be different, but I feel that it is not necessary for us to have to use this information and take data to them. That's what the coaches are going to translate to them as well. I'm happy to have that debate. I have it all the time. So now we know our audience. The reason that's important is because they dictate your language. Good Place? Anyone? Anyone? Just me, again. She's alone. Anyway, The Good Place is a phenomenal TV show. I highly recommend that you watch it, but I loved this, thinking about The Good Place and how it's an object lesson that if you want to fit a broken system, you have to rely on the people directly impacted by the system for input and guidance. So that's why we had to ask ourselves who, is because it's going to matter who we're talking to tell us how they want information. So now we have the what, we have the why, and we have the who. How do we put all this together? This is the fun part. So, does anyone recognize this character? Yes, who is it? Wilson, okay. I love to talk about the Wilson principle. If you aren't familiar with this character, it's a volleyball. Tom Hanks, I almost said Tom Cruise. Tom Hanks was stranded on an island, and this inanimate object became his friend. He had conversations with him. So this is my challenge at the foundation of data-driven storytelling. Choose the Wilson principle. Give your data a voice, okay? And what that means is that you need to take the knowledge that you have or that you've gleaned and translate it over to your audience, depending on which one of those they are. All right? We talked about the who. My experience is, in sport, your most direct path to adoption is to start by listening to your players. That's the language of the game, right? I don't hear players in my sport, personally, I know that football's a little more advanced, talking about XG. But if I say to them, what did you like about that shot? It was a great high-quality chance. High quality, aha. Quality is what I'm going to use when I talk to you, okay? So start with your players, because their language is the language of the game, and that's going to be a great starting place for you to know how to start translating your concepts into information that people can receive. So, translation 101. Here's how to do my job, I think. Know your stuff. It is essential that before you start to begin communication, that you know the ins and outs of whatever concept you're trying to communicate. I can't go into a locker room and say to a player, so I think that if you pass, if you, wait, hold on, let me check. You've got to go in there and know exactly what you're talking about. And you need to put in the time to know how your audience likes information, their language, how much time they like to spend, and what they value. This is a story I tell all the time. I used to cover a coach who was actually a very analytical thinker. He just never called it that. But all the concepts he had in mind were concepts analytics were telling us were relevant to success. And there's a concept in hockey called shot assists. The player who passes the puck to a player who takes the shot. I did not go to this coach and say, hey, do shot assists matter? I said, how valuable is it to have a player who can put the puck on this certain player's stick so he can shoot, because he's your best goal scorer? Got a great answer. He's super valuable. This is why that player doesn't get credit, but this is what matters. And then I could go to the player who was so good at those shot assists. I could say, hey, it seems like every time you complete a pass, a shot comes after it. Is that something you worked on? Is that a skill? Where did you learn it from? So in all this, I was talking about shot assists, and I was talking about the fact that shot assists are a good predictor to goals, but I never said that to my audience. And then I turned all those quotes and video and story back around to, at the time, what were my readers, to teach them what shot assists were. Okay? So, some other things about translation. Be ready to learn. I have also walked into the locker room and said, hey, what about this thing? And you know, that was so cool. There was a certain kind of pass I was obsessed with 2 years ago. You know, when you did that pass, that's really cool. What is this? It really means nothing, is what I got. And after 5 players, I stopped. I took my L and moved on, okay? So be ready to learn, and to that point, be ready to be wrong. All right? We have to show some grace in recognizing that as sophisticated and amazing as our data is, there's still going to be nuance that maybe we haven't just captured yet. All right? So let's take this to the next step. Translate to communicate. When we started this talk, we talked about knowing your what. And I find this is a struggle that I have as well. We put so much time into our research, so much important work, that when it comes time to share it, we want to share all of that again. We have to challenge ourselves to find brevity and different methods of communication. And to that, I suggest using visuals. Now, there aren't a ton of hockey people in here, I know, but if I asked you all, where on the ice does this team shoot from the most, you probably can tell, right? So the idea of a picture being worth 1,000 words certainly holds true when we communicate. When you are looking to use any sort of visual representation, and I will stress to you, I include tables in this as well. Make sure the visual that you are putting together makes sense. Does it show what I think it's showing? Will other people understand what I'm trying to convey? My husband is so sick of, can you read this, please? But that's what happens a lot. How will my audience use this, view this, and how does it look? Huge point here, color blindness. All right? My first year really going into charts, I had green everywhere. Green was all over the place. Until one of my friends came and said, do you realize you're making this very difficult for people who are colorblind? And I went, oh no. So that matters. Font size matters. Font type matters. It all matters based on what your audience is going to connect with. And ultimately, please, 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 use what's right instead of what's cool. When I first learned ggplot, I had the coolest stuff you've ever seen. But it didn't show what I wanted it to show. So I'd end up calling my friend, and she'd work it up in Tableau, and then it looked perfect. Even after I spent all my hours researching all my commands and everything, it was 5 minutes in Tableau, and that was the message I needed. So again, that what's my point, what's my point, what's my point voice is going in your head. Just some examples, again, to challenge you to think about different ways at looking at information. This is a look at a player's game, shots for versus against while they were on the ice. We can look at duration. This was one of my ggplot cool things that I learned, was to pull apart a series of campaigns each year over year of a certain goaltender. Don't even get me started on the goaltender, but here's where we are. You can also compare, of course. Again, I'm just challenging you to think about different ways to use visuals to send a message. And ultimately, I'm going to share with you a little bit, unfortunately, I apologize, of my work from this past season. All season, we talked about power play formations. When a team is on the penalty kill, they've taken a penalty, they're down a skater, and the need to be in formation. That's been proven to be a key to success. So we talked about that, and then also preventing opponents from getting in the most dangerous areas of the ice. This is a little bit from our broadcast. Secondarily, it's going to be about controlling your play and formation. In the first power play goal for the Stars, they wasted no time getting into their power play formation, and the Kraken got right into their diamond. You have to have some structure when you're playing a skater down, but that structure started to collapse, and that gave Jason Robertson so much space. The Dallas Stars were behind the Kraken defense, and that first goal goes in. The other thing that was missing in the second game was controlling the chances that the Stars got in the most dangerous areas of the ice. So there you go. So we showed them systems. We talked about when they are in place, when they're not. And we showed them areas of the ice to protect, all just while they were watching the game. Okay? Another thing I want to introduce for your consideration, particularly if you're working with that internal audience that we talked about. We saw such cool things up here today coming from StatsBomb. And that's the idea. I'm seeing this more and more in hockey of if you need to communicate something, particularly to a non-stats-based audience, and I'm speaking specifically about scouts and potentially coaches, a lot of internal app development is starting to happen, where we almost in a way gamify the data that we have so that it's easier for a scout to use to put in their reports or for a coach to use. It makes it more accessible. Because everyone has an iPhone or an Android with 200 apps on it. And now what do I think of a player here, here, here? Because maybe there's some colors, maybe there's some grid bars. It's awesome. So consider that as well. All right, so let's end with one final example, just to kind of put all these pieces together of something that I introduced to our Kraken community year one. And it's a type of pass called a Royal Road pass. The team created this cute, isn't this cute? Analytics with Alison. Haha, clever. I was horrified, but that's what it's called. And it's a series of articles where I started to talk about the types of passes that were the most dangerous. There was some written explanation, as you can see, links to some resources. There was some video in it, and there was also video coming from games where I would reinforce these types of dangerous passes. And when a pass happened in the game, I said, you just saw this happen, that's that pass. That's the kind of pass you want to see. Okay, and then ultimately, one more clip. I apologize.
Now,
everything came
we
together.
talk about this kind of pass all the time. I want to focus on it. It's a cross-slot or Royal Road pass. What it does is it challenges Jake Ottinger to move laterally, and you have to have enough force to move quickly, but not too quickly, so you can still seal off the post and close off all the holes. And that's why it's such a difficult challenge to the goaltender.
So there you go. Building, 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 adding different types of communication to make this effective. Let's wrap up with just some quick tips. When you are looking to drive adoption, please don't be a black box. You need to be able to explain the concept that you are sharing. You must understand the concept as we talked about. You must be able to translate it, and you need to slow down. We've already thought through all these points, and now we're rushing one point at a time. Finally, I will share with you, we've all seen this, right? If you want to become better at communication, I challenge you to change the rule. Listen to the feedback that you are getting. First and foremost, find the truth. One of my mentors told me even a bit of negative feedback has some truth in it. So give yourself some grace. Say, yeah, that's crazy, but what's the kernel of truth? When you find the feedback loop, see what people are clicking with. What do they like? Sometimes I would write something, people go, oh, this is great that you taught me this. I'm like, that's not what I taught you. Right? So find out what's resonating with your audience. Similarly, what was misinterpreted, and pay attention to communication styles. In addition to the types of audiences that we talked about, I'm sure you all know there are tons of different visual, verbal, there are disc communication styles. Use those tools to your advantage. Vent privately and explain publicly. All right, so in conclusion, make friends with people smarter than you. That's how you're going to learn cool stuff. That's how you're going to learn cool ways to communicate. Use the very best tools that you can. Make sure your data is 1,000,000% correct, because when we talk about adoption, in my experience, the minute someone can invalidate your work, they're done with you. And finally, cite, cite, cite. Give credit to those who have inspired you. Give credit to those who are doing the source work that you might be referencing, but give those people their flowers as well. This is information on where you can contact me if you would like. I'm obviously very passionate about this. I thank you all so very much for your time. I hope you have a great rest of the conference.